Hello and welcome back. I'm Ricardo, aka the Mad Hatter, and this is a series about color theory where we learn how to use light and color creatively to aid in our work. In the previous episodes we looked at the basics of color, specifically how it influences our mind, our thoughts, our moods, how it works, how to categorize it, and how to discuss about color technically. With all those information established and clear in our mind, we are finally ready to discuss color harmony. Before moving on with today's topic though, I would highly recommend you check the previous videos in the series, as those are essential for you to understand what we're going to discuss today. Also, if you're enjoying the content and you'd like to help me make it even better, consider leaving a comment below this video letting me know what you like and what you'd like to see next. If you don't want to miss future episodes, please consider subscribing and leave a thumb up to the video. Without further ado though, let's jump into today's topic. As usual, we're going to have first a brief theory portion, and then we're going to go into more specific use cases that are prepared into DaVinci. Color harmony by itself is a compendium of principles that help us understand how colors behave in relation to one another. As a matter of fact, one color on its own has a meaning, as we discussed in episode 4 with color psychology, but two colors in conjunction can amplify each other or can help us make one standing out compared to the other, and thus can help us make an image more interesting or better conveying a message. So the first of the different topics that we're going to analyze today is color context. As we saw in the previous video, we can use one property of color, specifically hue, to take all different colors and put them in a circle that we're going to call the color wheel. If we now take a look at this color wheel, we can see that some colors live next to each other, while others live on opposite sides of the wheel. Depending on where a color lives compared to another, these two will contrast more or less. Specifically, two colors that live next to each other will contrast less than two colors that live opposite to the circle. In other words, the greater the distance between the two colors, the better the contrast between them. It is important to notice that color context does not depend only on the hue. For example, we can have two very similar hues, but one on a light shade and one on a darker, and still we'll get quite some color contrast. Similarly, the same color on two different backgrounds that are equally grey, but one is lighter and one is darker, will appear darker or brighter because the context influences our eye, as we can see in this optical illusion. Now, another important factor is the color warmth or temperature. Specifically, colors can be warm or cool. We define reds, yellows and oranges as warm colors, while greens, blues and magentas are cool colors. If we now think at the two characteristics that we just discussed, it is important to make a note. Specifically, psychologically, our eye perceives as closer colors that are either brighter or warmer, and farther away colors that are darker or cooler. Does this ring any bells? You've probably heard of orange and teal. That is the most common color scheme that you can use or you can find in cinema, and if you think about it, orange is a warm color and it's usually allocated into the highlights or the midtones, while teal is a cool color that is usually allocated for shadows. This means that when we create an orange and teal image, effectively we're making the brighter regions look closer to us and the darker region look further away. This inherently creates a three-dimensional image on a bidimensional support. You just heard me refer to orange and teal as a color scheme. When you're creating the palette for a scene, you're effectively looking at the different colors in there and changing the relations between them. These relations are the color scheme of your scene, and they depend on the relative position of the different colors between one another on the color wheel. The simplest color scheme that we can think of is when we have just one color. In that case, we have a monochrome color scheme, and a notable example is Blade Runner 2049. When we start adding a few different variations around the same color, we usually have an analogous color scheme. As I don't want to make this video too long, for today we're going to stick with the monochromatic and the analogous color schemes. So let's jump into DaVinci. So here we are in DaVinci, and as you can see, I prepared a timeline with a few different clips. We're not going to look at all of them today, but just the ones that relate to monochrome and analogous color schemes. By the way, all the footage that you see here is provided by Artgrid, and if you want to get an awesome discount on that, check the description of the video. Back to the color schemes. As you can see, I've already prepared all the clips, but I'm also going to show you what I did and how I did it. Because effectively, a monochromatic color scheme can seem easy to achieve. Well, especially because we have just one color, creating depth in it is not that easy. A few key aspects to remember are that when there's no color contrast, you usually want to compensate it with some contrast with the light. Also, it doesn't matter how much you push your saturation, you should always have something in your scene where your eye can calibrate on. In this specific case, for example, you can see that although everything is really saturated, you can still see some sort of neutral areas in the blacks and in the highlights. I'm saying sort of because if we look at the vector scope, effectively nothing is really sitting in the dead center. I can also zoom in for you, and you can see even the most neutral parts are sitting slightly off center. That is okay. That is color context. Since we have so much saturation going on, the fact that these parts are just so less saturated compared to the rest, it makes them neutral to us. Now, let's look first at the Rec. 709 of this clip and then what I did to it. So let's deactivate all that I have done so far. So this is a Rec. 709, and the first thing I did was simply add some texture and a basic look to it. The showdown, I built it specifically for this tutorial, and it's sort of neutral, meaning that it does impart a few creative directions, but mostly it just adds some contrast and some saturation, but nothing really more to that. Now let's also create a new version. Okay, so I can reset what I did here, here, and here as well. So let me actually take out this node. So whenever I have a monochromatic color scheme, the first thing I tend to do is, well, if we go and look at the log, we can see that we have a bit of detail there that we might want to recover. And so we can simply take out our waveform, which in this case I usually like to have set to just my luminosity. And you can see effectively we're a bit crashed in the blacks, which might be okay in some cases, but in this specific case I just feel like it's a bit too much. So what we could do right away is go in our primaries, and you can see basically I'm using my panel to do that, and we're going to start raising the lift a bit. So keep an eye on the wheels and on the vector scope, sorry, on the waveform. And as I'm raising the shadows, I'm also pulling down the midtones. This starts adding more depth to the color. I can also add back some luminosity, going up with my gain, and then continuing the dance just a bit more here. And something like this, for example, you can see I'm softening a bit the shadows, I'm not really losing my highlights, but I'm creating much more contrast in these areas. Now, with this done, my next step usually is to create a few angles. As I was saying before, if I go into my vector scope, I want to sort of neutralize a bit the highlights and keep the shadows sort of neutrals as well, to give my eye somewhere to calibrate on. A trick to do that is actually to use the HSL curves, and specifically these three, so the Lume versus SAT, SAT versus SAT, and SAT versus Lume. The first thing I can do is to desaturate a bit the brighter area. So if I take these points, and I'm going to exaggerate it first so you can see what happens. If I exaggerate it and I go off and on, you can see that effectively I'm neutralizing quite a lot my higher areas. Now let's enable it once again, and let's start making this curve a bit more sensed. So we can bring back up this point a bit, somewhere about here. And we can also create a control point in this area. And what I usually do is sort of pull this point somewhere about here. So the dark parts of my image are not really affected, and these are the areas where most of my saturation lives. And then I'm slowly degrading the amount of saturation as I go up. Then I can start customizing the curve a bit more. Maybe I start pulling this down even more. I can even take this point and maybe pull it a bit further, somewhere about here. So a curve like this, for example, you can see it's really starting to give me some neutrality top of the image, but it's not really affecting the rest of it. We can add now a new node, and we can go into this area. We can desaturate a bit more the desaturated areas, and again I'm going to exaggerate it so you can see what happens. If I do that, well, given how saturated this image is, almost everything goes black and white, but if I raise this point back to somewhere about here, okay, you can see that what happens is that my neutral areas are getting even more neutral, okay, and the rest is not really getting affected. Of course, this is a bit too much, but what we can do is again make this curve a bit more sensed, and so we can go somewhere about here. We can create a control point sort of here where my top saturation lives, if we look at the histogram, and set it so it's at 0. And then we can take this point and pull it up slightly. Effectively, what this is doing is, if you look at the vector scope, is increasing my saturation without really touching the areas that are not saturated. Now let's add a new serial node, and let's finally go to this curve. You need to be very careful with this curve here, because breaking the image with this one is fairly easy, because if you start pulling down too much luminosity on saturated areas, what happens is, and you can see it here for example, that bright areas become too dark and thus they don't really make sense anymore. So what you want to do is be very gentle with this one, okay, and maybe just go somewhere about here. It is very soft, and you can see what he's doing is adding just a touch more depth to the saturated areas without really affecting too much the rest. As usual, we can create a control point sort of here so that not everything is getting affected as the same way. We can pull this down too much, and now we can pull this down a bit more, and now we can finally start refining the pre-curves in relation to each other. So if I'm doing this, I can see that already I'm getting a bit of a ring here because of this curve, but I like what this is doing on the other areas of the image. So what I can do is go back to my curve here and make it a bit more prominent, and we can shape this a bit more. And now, with these three curves in place like this, you can see that what we're getting is an image that effectively has a bit more compressed saturation, but still is very colorful, but has a lot more shape to it, a lot more tridimensionality to it. This though is just a start, because now that we have this in place and we have sort of the ankles established, we can go back to another node here where we start injecting more colors in the midtones to get more rich tones all around. And so what we can do is use the lift gamma again and start pushing way more blue into our midtones. And again, I'm gonna first go too much, and then I'm gonna start compensating it with my gain here, okay, and with my shadows as well. And then I'll keep going. I'll keep pushing more colors in the midzones, which is where the majority of the image lives, and then I'm going to balance it out with my gain and with my lift. And with this done, you can see how much color we're getting. But since we have the ankles in place, we are still keeping the ankles where they need to be. Effectively, if I just deactivate the ankles, you can see how much these are doing to our image to clean it up. Effectively, this image is done the same way. You can see this compound node has the same structure in place, where if I go on and off, you can see how much this is taking care of the color in the highlights. And then I have, well, in this case, just one node. Honestly, I really liked how it looked. I didn't feel like I needed to push it too much. I just have a node here that is slightly changing the contrast to make it match a bit better with this other clip. Let's now go to another image. And in this case, this is just a drop popping into a liquid. Okay, this is Phantom Flex, awesome slow motion. So we can stop it here, park it here. And you can see what I've done here. Well, the base is sort of the same. So if we deactivate everything, I started by adding my ankles, where I'm simply cleaning up whatever is not so saturated or is simply meant to be brighter and thus a bit less saturated. And then what I did was, in this case, really giving more meat to the image. So again, let's go and add a new version and show you what I've done. Oh, and by the way, this is just a vignette, nothing too complicated, nothing too fancy, just a very soft window where the mids pull down ever so slightly to make the edges darker. That said, what I've done mainly on this one is bringing the image down, because you see, the more we add to the midtones, the more colors we can get into our image. So what we can start to do is sort of the same dance that we did before, where we start bringing down the midzone, and as we do, also bringing up the lift as well. And let's go actually to the waveform for this one. Okay, so we're going to bring down the midzone quite a lot and then bring up the lift just to compensate. And probably I need to go here where I have a bit of a more of a black point to check on my scopes, and keep doing this, pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, and always compensating with the gain as well, so that my highlights don't get, you know, too dark. Whenever you're doing this massive push, one advice I would give you is to split it into two nodes. So let's start with this node that does sort of the heavy lifting for me, but then let's refine it in another node. This is because now my gamma wheel effectively has more effect on the midtones, because these are already brought down by the action of the node before. So I can add a bit even more contrast. Keep going with this dance basically. And you can see that as I'm doing this, the trace is getting also thicker in the waveform. The reason why this is getting thicker is because I'm stretching it. So if we look at these two nodes before and after, you can see that effectively I'm not really changing the black and white point too much, but I'm adding a lot of meat to this image, a lot. So now this is supposed to be some kind of alcoholic beverage. So I would say this doesn't look as the right color to it. So we can just go into our curves in the hue versus hue and just tweak a bit the red and yellow to simply get more of a golden color. Somewhere about here. Yeah, this looks like something I would drink. Right. And as you can see here is just a hue versus hue change. And another small trick is we now have basically red, that is the core of the image, the darker parts, and yellow, that is sort of like the highlights. So if we actually pull down the luminance of the red and pull up the luminance of the yellow, we can get even more three-dimensionality to the image. something like this. Maybe this is a bit too much, so let's bring up this a bit more. There we go. And you can see here how three-dimensional this looks. So if I go, you know, before and after, you can see how much this is doing. Jumping now to this shot, I wouldn't define this specifically as a monochromatic, honestly. If you look at the original image, this has a bit of color contrast. So what I did is I made it an analogous type of color scheme, and you can see it here. So we still have a bit of variation between like sort of almost yellows and reds. So we start to spread out a bit in terms of the colors, but we're not really moving away from the orange area. Now the way I did it is fairly simple. This node here is similar to what we saw in the previous clips. So it has the 3 curves for the HSL to control basically the highlights and the shadows and their neutrality. Then what I did, I simply worked with lift gamma gain to neutralize a bit the sort of greenish, tealish tint that we had in the shadows, take away some of the redness from the skin tones and still keeping the highlights quite warm. So you can see this one alone, what it is doing. It's really cleaning up my whites and blacks and still giving a very nice skin tone to our dude. And then I simply went in with my hue versus sat and slightly toned down the saturation. And this again has to do with color context. With other shots where we have a lot of color going on, we could probably get away with so saturated skin tones. But in this case, since everything around is so neutral, this level of saturation just feels out of place. And as we control it, we get a much more believable, much more neutral image. Finally, let's go to these 3 shots here. Okay, and specifically let's go to this one, because that's the one that I used originally for the grade. This is Sony footage. This is shot on a Sony a7 III's. And once again, if we look at what this was before, this was really flat. And here we can see what I was discussing before, where I said that when you have not much color contrast, you start to need more luminance contrast. You can still keep a low-con look, don't get me wrong, because what we end up having here is still, in my book, a low-con. You can see how lifted the blacks are, but we'll still get more contrast that it originally has, or at least enough contrast to create some interest between all the shapes that we see on screen. We have these clean anchors here. You've noticed that I have it in every single one of these clips. I feel like this is really helpful when you want to clean up the anchors and sort of give the eye a neutral area to look at to sort of balance your eye. And then, well, I simply went on and used my lift gamma gain to impart some color to the image basically, and added, well, this is like dawn or sunset, most probably sunset, and so I wanted a lot of gold in this image. I really wanted a lot of gold, and that's what I got, basically combining the gamma, which is going to this yellowish orange, and gain, which is really going to yellow. This is very important. Whenever you want to get gold, it's really about the green rather than the yellow. Then what I did is simply complement these 2 pushes with a cyan push on the lift, while though keeping an eye on the vector scope to make sure that I never really went to cyan. And then I simply went into my waveform and used the lift gamma gain to add more contrast. And what you can see here is that effectively I'm not really changing too much the black and white level. Yeah, the black level is getting a bit deeper, somewhat like 5% of more black. We're not really changing the white point, but we're really stretching the in-between, and that's where the contrast comes from. This is not a contrasty image, in the general sense of the term because it doesn't have pushed black and white points, but it has a lot of contrast in the midtones. The goal with this image is to show you that you can still have a low con with an analogous color scheme as long as you find ways to introduce some contrast in the midtones where it's really needed, and fake some color contrast, playing with very saturated and very not saturated areas. You can see like this suit, the stripes, they almost look like they are bluish. Effectively, they are yellow. If I look at the where the trace on the vector scope is, this is yellow. But again, this is color context. Color context tricks my eye into believing that this is actually not yellow, not a dark yellow, but more like blue. Well, that's a wrap on this video. As usual, I hope you enjoyed the content. In the next episode, we're going to look at complementary and split complementary color schemes. Thank you for your time. I'll see you soon.